Welcome to Compass, Finding Spirituality in the Everyday. My name is Ryan Dunn. I am the host of Compass, and we're back. If you've been anticipating this episode in real time, you'll notice that we're late in releasing it. We had some technical inconveniences that have limited our distribution to some podcast channels. That should now be resolved. So you can resume consuming the Compass podcast on your podcast listening or viewing platform of choice. In this episode, I got to speak with Bruce Reyes-Chow, who is an influential voice in progressive Christianity. We discussed his newfound interest in houseplants. Just kidding, we did, but we also really got into the evolving future of the church, advocating for greater diversity, inclusivity, and a more nuanced portrayal of Christianity in the media, which is timely as we're releasing this episode in the course of an American election season that contains a lot of dialogue around the American witness of Christianity and, explicitly, Christian nationalism. Bruce shares his vision for distilling complex theological concepts into accessible and impactful faith montages, which offer a progressive entry point for those curious about the church. And there's so much more. Bruce is really a fun person to speak with. I think that you'll enjoy this listen. If you enjoy listening to Compass on the regular, leave a rating and or review. It helps us get seen and it draws more interesting guests to the podcast. So thank you so much for doing that. Bruce Reyes-Chow, a little bit about him. He's an author, speaker, parent, consultant, coach, podcaster, and pastor. He speaks and writes on issues of faith, technology, race, parenting, and church culture. His most recent book is called Everything Good About God is True. And the book helps us address not just what we don't believe, which is easy to express for a lot of us, but it also addresses how our lived experiences help refine that which we do truly believe about God and faith. So that sounds really cool. Let's meet Bruce Reyes-Chow on the Compass podcast. Bruce Reyes-Chow, thank you so much for joining us. How goes it with your soul today?
Oh, it is good. If COVID wasn't hanging out in my household, it'd be even better. So I will make it through without coughing up a lung. But overall, life is good. It is nice and toasty out here whenever this is posting out. We're in that heat wave in California, and it is. But I'm in a nice, cool office. I've been on the road a lot, surrounded by my familiar plants, and this is one of my pandemic hangovers. Is I got into houseplants and propagating houseplants. So there you go. So life is good.
Are those the same plants that you got back in 2020? Because they look like they're really fantastic.
A couple of them are babies. Like I've really gotten into. I think the answer to the question, can you have too many plants, is no. So I just snip. And one of the things that I do when people come over to visit, when we are able to do that, is I invite people to walk through 2 of our rooms and take any potted plant home that they want.
Oh,
because
that's very sweet of you.
We just have a bunch of them. And my wife is always like, do we need to buy more plants? I'm like, no, because I can propagate them now. Anyway. There you go. More than you need to know about. It's a gardening podcast today.
That's right. So do you find that what is the proper watering amount? And all right. So we've rehashed the year 2020. In your book, you address readers in the possible year of 2050. I would love to know, what do you think the church might look like in the year 2050?
Oh yeah. Oh gosh. I mean, again, if I could really predict that, who knows? So here's what I would say is that for those who do read the book, I am not one that is an anti-denominational or anti-association or any of those kinds. I help to explain why those exist, and usually it's because how we make decisions and govern ourselves. And I actually think there is a lovely mix of the different ways that people are drawn to making decisions in our setting. Like, how do you discern the mind of Christ and the will of God together? And what does that look like? Is it a smaller group of people that help decide? Is it a larger group? So what I hope the church looks like in terms of just structurally is that there are a lot of versions of how people are engaged in church in the future that help to give breadth and depth and texture to how we do church. Now, what we believe, what I hope, I'm just going to say here's what I hope. I hope that when journalists, pundits, they want to say the church, we have forced them to give more descriptors than that, because right now the narrative that holds our attention and gets the play is a very white conservative Christian nationalist version of the gospel. And when somebody says that's the church, it gets very little pushback other than those of us who are like, but that's not the only church. And that just doesn't, it's like, but us, I want to force those who are driving cultural narratives to have to think about different versions of Christianity, and that's is where it's, for me, we have to help the culture get there. So I'm just going to pretend that we've done a great job, and in 2050, when CNN says the church, they have to say the church, the part of the church that to help people delineate that we're not all just this as the default. So that's, I don't know how much money I'd bet on it, but that's my hope. Right, so there you go.
Well, I had this question all lined up for you that I was particularly proud of, and it had to do with adages and kind of distilling theology into simplistic sayings, and then I realized, like, oh well, you already kind of came up with it for us, and then the name of your book is Everything Good About God is True. But I want to ask the question anyway, even though that might be an answer to it, in saying that, as you talked about the Christian nationalist aspect of the church, or even the fundamentalist aspect of the church, like, part of their success, part of the reason why they get the microphone so much is that their message can be pretty simple sometimes. And their adages like, well, the Bible says it, or God said it, I believe it, that settles it. Besides maybe everything good about God is true, are there some similar adages that might describe this other side of the church?
Yeah. I mean, I think part of why, again, huge generalizations we're speaking of, but why that kind of, conservative-ish version is because they have convinced us that there is security in specificity, and that if you can just own these 10 things, then all will be right in the world and with God. And that never fit well with me. I mean, I didn't grow up in that. Wasn't even adjacent to it. I grew up with its expansive nature of God, and that there was great security in knowing that God was this expansive place, and that God could handle me in all the versions that I am. I mean, I come out of a small urban church in Stockton, California, all kinds of trouble in life and community, and it was a place where we were reminded that God can handle whatever we bring. And I think that has always stuck with me, is that, there are some folks that leave all that stuff behind when you come into this holy space. And I'm like, actually, no. Bring it all in. We hold it together, right? Bring everything in. Bring everything to the table, because God's love is big enough to hold all of it. And so I think those, figuring out how we distill without, oversimplifying, what it means for God to be expansive. And this is where I think leadership, we have gotten lazy, that we want to over-explain everything, and we don't know how to distill what we believe into digestible, because we look down in some ways, right? We look down on that. And I'm like, well, no, we got to be able to, like, if you can't summarize your sermon in an X length thing, people aren't going to get it. Like, you get all that other stuff is great, but if I can't preach a sermon and then somebody walks away and I'm like, just in a couple sentences, what was that about? And if I haven't been able to communicate something, not as if everybody gets what I'm trying to communicate every time, but I need to be able to do that. So I'm always focusing on what's that 2 or 3 sentence, 1 sentence thing that I'm trying to get across, and all this stuff other kind of bounces. So, I look at things like, you are enough. Yeah, God loves you, and you are enough. Right? Yeah. It goes against that idea that you need to be more for God, when I think that you're a transactional theology. If you are more, then God will do this. So as I'm like, well, God loves me and tells me that no matter who I am enough. And out of that love, then I'm trying to be even better. Right. So There's lots of those kinds of things, and in the book, this montage that I go through, there's lots of in there that I think will fit that same need for people to have something that's bite sized, but I hope more meaningful. So yeah, so there's like quite a few of them in there.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about that montage a little bit.
Yeah.
You endorse kind of creating a faith montage. So what does that concept really entail?
Well, I mean, I wish it was deeper than I'm a Gen Xer and every Gen X movie had some kind of montage in it. I mean, that's really what, at the core, that's really what it was.
I got to know then, because they always have a soundtrack too. Like what's the soundtrack of your faith montage?
It's interesting. So mine would be kind of like 80s R&B kind of thing, where in other times it's going to be poppy, like Dexy's Midnight Runner, that kind of thing. Like that'll be but for me, montages were great because you knew it was leading you somewhere, but you just got bits and pieces of it getting you to the point, and it sped the movie along. And that's kind of how I see this. I could have certainly called it a faith statement, but I was like, yawn. Like that's something that we all have, and there's nothing
sounds very academic
about that.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's, for those who are reading it who kind of come out of the church, faith statements often can be checklists to what are you supposed to believe in order for us to be included in this. And I think I wanted to get away from that as well. And a faith journey didn't have enough gravitas to me. So that I landed on faith montage as a way that you could actually dip into it at any point, but it does help you kind of start to end think about the fullness. I mean, the book itself is an audacious, super arrogant project, right? They asked me to write a book on Christianity, and I'm like, well, the whole thing? Like all of it? Like, yeah. Like what? Can you see the whole thing? Yeah. And I'm like, sure. I had written this montage and thought it could be something, and we had begun to navigate, and it was originally going to be a memoir, more of a spiritual memoir, and those are not, unless you're famous, those don't really work very well. And they wanted something that had more longevity, which I really appreciated. And so they were like, no, let's frame this as a primer on progressive Christianity. And then that way it is the what's next as you are reaching a healthy point of deconstruction. Like if there is still a lot of trauma involved in your deconstruction, you may not be open to this quite yet. But if you're like, okay, I'm still curious about the church, there's still something here, this is the entry point into that, or an invitation into one way to think about it. So that's kind of the montage for me. It gave me a little more freedom to be a little bit more creative. I loved writing it. I love reading it, actually. I love reading my own stuff, and that's not an arrogance, I think. It's more of a nod to, if you're not transformed by your own work, then nobody else will be. And so I still believe greatly what I've written, and I love watching how other people are using it in liturgy and other stuff. But so the montage, I mean, again, it's not much deeper than that's what I grew up with in the movies, but it does fit a purpose.
Yeah. Well, I love that imagery of it. Was there a process that you used to develop your own montage?
Yeah. I did. The first round I just wrote, and then as I started to think about, okay, this could be a project of some kind. I don't know what exactly it was going to be, probably a book, but I started to think about what was missing. And so I actually, for those that aren't connected with me online, I'm super over visible about everything I do, depending on your context. And so I'm like, okay, here I'm writing this thing. What's missing? Like what needs to be answered? And so I shared it out ahead of time, and people kind of said, well, and I'm like, you can like or not like parts, which is fine. But are there things that if you were handing this to somebody who was curious about faith, even for the first time, what do you want to make sure that gets touched upon? And not just like these big theological questions, but I was a church planter. I started a church in San Francisco 1 million years ago, and people didn't really care about the big theological things. Like, why are there so many different kinds of churches? Like, that was a core question. Why do we baptize people in so many different ways? Like, why? And so I try to do that and get it all the way to the ground level, as well as infusing in, when we talk about God's plan, that can be really dangerous, but here's a way to think about it that is more in line with the rest of our theological space. So, so I did it individually. I crowdsourced a little bit, which has always been my vibe. Is here is something I'm offering. Help me figure out and make this better. And then here's where we go together. And I generally am pretty good about separating people's opinion and likes and dislikes versus content that could help be better. So so that's what I did. I just shared it out, and people are always interested in talking about a theology that would help them in their work, for sure. I mean, it's really interesting though. I had colleagues read this book ahead of time as we were going through some review times, and one person said to me, "Oh, I could have wrote that book," and I was like, "But you didn't." So, but it's a conglomeration of a lot of people's thinking. So a lot of people won't find much surprising, but I think it will be an accessible, clearer version of what many of us have believed for a long time.
Yeah. Well, maybe your colleague was expressing maybe not sort of the surety that he or she could have written the book, but that almost that they wished they had written the book. I mean,
oh
so
yeah,
often
totally. No, it was a good friend. It was good friend of mine. A good friend of mine is like, "Oh, I could have wrote that." I'm like, "Yeah, but you didn't." So just read it and let me know what you think.
Something that resonates with us, it oftentimes I find is something that gives words to something that I feel but hadn't been able to express before. And and it sounds like you're really trying to invest in doing that for a lot of people. Like when they give you this mandate to, okay, write a manifesto for progressive Christianity, like it's kind of boiling down to that, though, isn't it? Like giving.
I mean, it really is. And I'm very cautious as folks read this that the definitive article I use all the time is a, not the. And so that it is a version. It is, it's a version of the gospel as opposed to the version. Like it. What I hope it does is it gives a good baseline from which people can spring off into their own thinking about things. And I do a whole section on We Are All Theologians at the beginning to kind of give permission and challenge all of us to have these conversations about God. And if that's something folks are curious about, then here's a way to begin to prime the pump around that. Not just like, well, what do you think about God? Well, it's not really helpful if you've never really had to think about that before, or the only version you have is something that you are like rejecting right now. Like, well, here's another way to think about it. And what I've heard is that it's pretty accessible and it does give some language to some things that people have been thinking. So, that's exactly what I'm trying to do.
Yeah. One of the aspects that you wrote about that resonated with me is the idea that we struggle to articulate what it is that we do believe. We don't have that same struggle often articulating what we don't believe. So, and I can think about it this way: a term like salvation, like I can tell you what I don't believe about salvation. What I kind of rail against when we use that word, but it becomes a little bit tougher to express the proactive or positively aligned aspects of what I do. So, how did this process of writing this book help you to articulate some of the things that you do believe?
Well, I will say that it helped me really refine what I believe. I mean, it's one of those things that, again, that when you said before, it's giving words to people. I think folks are like, yes, this is what I'm thinking. Because we fall back onto like just trite phrases and language in our liturgy and our hymns, and we just buy into these things. Like a great way that I think about salvation, right, is we always think about it as the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. And I was like, actually, I think it's the life, death, and resurrection. Like it is, we are connected to God through the living Jesus, but all of our theological language is always death and resurrection, as opposed to, well, let's broaden that out and expand that out. I'm not getting rid of the death of the resurrection. What I'm talking about is it's fuller than that, actually. And that makes more sense to people around like, oh, I'm experiencing this connection to God through the fullness of who Jesus is. And so forcing me to articulate, and what really forced me to do is, when you have to do all this in 40,000 words, you really have to choose words well. Like my editor was amazing and gentle when she needed to be, and also just challenging when it was important around, okay, so what do you really like? We're stripping this down. Give me the 4 sentences. What does baptism mean? I'm like, oh my God, 4 sentences, right? But we have to do that. And I think that the challenge for some of us who I think land in this space is we over-explain everything. And we use a lot of words when we don't need to. And we almost use our words as a crutch sometimes. And we spin ourselves into confusion for people. When I think, if we're talking to people who are new or reintroducing themselves to this version, we have to be pretty clear. And so I think everybody needs to work on that. And that's one of the hopes, is that you like, so then what do you think about salvation? And you have to practice that. Like it's not as if I was like, oh yeah, salvation in four sentences. It was more like, okay, the first version was like 70,000 words or something. I don't know what it was. And we had to trim it all the way back. Wow. Because I wanted everybody to know every nuance about the 7 versions of atonement that are out there. And she's like, we can't do that. You got to name these other things. Which are the problematic ones? Why? And then where do you land? Right? And we should all try to go through those processes together and figure out what do we really believe, so that we can articulate to people who are curious about it.
Well, how might your book help individuals then articulate what it is that they believe? Is it the process of building the montage, or?
I think there's a variety of ways, depending on who is reading it. What I've heard is, pastors in some ways, because most of them are like, oh, well, yeah, I could have done this. It's not really for them. I always tell them, like, well, this isn't really for you. I may write a book for ministers later, but this one is for the people. What I hope it's like, you're like, oh, yeah, this is something that I can give to people to spark conversation. There's about 6 churches that used it for their summer series, right? They broke it down and used it. It's an easy thing if you need programming, like just hand them this and you block it out. For others who are reading it, say you're just a person in the pew, as they say, what I've heard is that it gives a little more texture to things that they've been saying out loud and singing about for a long time, but didn't really know what it meant. And they've been in the church too long to ask, right? That awkward moment where like, I've been hanging out with you for a few months, but I still don't know your name, and now it's too late for me to ask what your name is. There has been a lot of that. That's kind of unexpected. I actually like that. They're like, oh, okay, so that's what I've been thinking this might mean, but we don't really, we talk about God's plan all the time, and and we sing about it and all these things. Anyway, so that, and then the last group are folks that are just curious about faith. So those are on that post-deconstruction space. Those who have been dabbling, have a cultural, maybe obligatory connection to church, but still something draws them to church and spirituality. And this has been a way for folks to get a little more meat on what they've been experiencing. So those are kind of how people are doing it. And the questions at the back, are both group and individual. So there's a group question each time. I know some of the prayers are being used in places just so that folks can. It's what I try to do is weave all the elements of what living faith may be. So individual, group, prayer, and I hope the stories are inviting. They will hopefully age well, and give like kind of this fullness of how we all experience faith throughout our life.
You mentioned us having a need to simplify what it is that we think about and even how we express it. But you also note that it's possible that God created human beings to be really complex. So how does recognizing our complexity and that God created us in this kind of complex range of human experience, how does that change the way that we might approach faith?
I think there's lots of ways, but my primary thing these days has been we either believe that everybody is a complex created, child of God, or we don't. And then does not matter how we treat everyone. So even our deepest enemies, right? We're told clearly in Scripture, there's lots of things that are easier to follow, right? Feed those who are hungry, clothe those who are naked. We might even visit people who are incarcerated, give drink, all those things those are great and easy, but bless your enemy and do not curse them. We are not good at that. And that goes both ways. And I think that by truly believing that even our worst enemy is created and complex, we have to allow that to change how we behave. Now, that doesn't mean we agree or we affirm actions or beliefs or any of that. It just means that how we respond to that person can't diminish their humanity. And I think that's what the world wants. War and violence feeds on dehumanization. And if we can make small and large steps in how we interact with each other online or what we say about those we disagree with in conversation, then we are saying to evil, basically, not today. Like, you're not going to win today. And I think that that's really hard in these political times, but really necessary. I mean, I just think that the more we dehumanize other people, the more we are not going to find any common space. And we can't do it as a transactional thing, right? We can't, well, they don't do it to us. They don't humanize us, so why would I humanize them? Like, well, I don't humanize another person just so it gets me something. I do that because God has said to me, I see you as this complex person. In response to that, you should see all of, my creation as such. And that is hard and excruciating, and it's sometimes more fun to just give it right back.
Yeah.
But I think it only lasts for a moment, and then we realize that's not a helpful people to be.
So are there practices that you use to kind of check yourself? Or to keep you grounded
I'm
looking at people?
I'm super annoying. I'm super annoying to others and myself. So like if somebody says they're a pile of whatever, I'm like, are they actually a pile of that, or are they just doing things that are that? Right? I mean, how do we separate? Right?
Yes, I see that as being annoying.
Right? Yeah. There you go. My wife is particularly excited. Like, oh, they're trash. I'm like, well, are they? Like, is anybody trash? I mean, that's what I say about black and brown bodies in the U.S., right? We have decided that they can be disposed of and made indivisible in our carceral system. I don't think that's true. We wouldn't want anybody to think that, and I'm not going to reciprocate that to other people. Now, do people need to be held accountable for the action? Yes, but at their very core being, they are not trash, right? And so I really watch myself and watch my language, watch what I pass on online, watch what I'm going to forward or what I'm going to share, because I don't want to add to this idea that we can just diminish somebody else's humanity without even thinking about it. And I think that is too easy. So I am very disciplined about thinking about everything that I share or say, that whether it diminishes their humanity. And I still want to challenge. Like, I'm not a big fan of former President Trump. I'm not a huge fan of current President Biden either. But I'm not going to fall into ableism and ageism and all those things. Right? I'm going to challenge thoughts, beliefs, but not ability, age, those kinds of things. And that's hard to do because it's so easy. It's just sitting right there. But I think that's the easy, lazy way out. And I think we're called to something better.
Yeah. Well, and it's easy to do, especially when the snowball of public opinion is kind of cascading down that way, right?
Oh, yeah. Yep.
As we're recording this, it kind of is. But
Yep, exactly.
What you mentioned that you learned something in reading your own writing. How was the process of putting this thing together a learning expedition for you, or how were you transformed by it?
Ooh. I am fully committed to my faith. Like I just, and people will say, but then is it the only way? And I'm like, no, I say in the book, Jesus is not the only way to experience God and the divine. And I'm very clear with that. And they're like, well, what about when it says, and I'm like, okay, we're not getting into scripture wars because those are exhausting to me and useless. But I'm like, I can live with the tension. And I actually think that sometimes scripture is wrong. So there you go. And so, when somebody says to me, well, Jesus says the only way through God is through me, I'm like, I can fully say that for myself. That is my only way to God. Is that for everybody? No, there's just too much in the world that says to me that's not the only way, that people have connected to God in whatever form God is taking in many, many ways. And so, there's all the mental gymnastics that others have done to talk about people who've never had an opportunity to experience Jesus and the need to evangelize and be missionaries and all that kind of stuff. I just don't fall into that. So, but I'm like, yeah, I am committed to this adventure with Jesus. And I would say that one of the things that I think surprises people in there is I'm still committed to the bodily resurrection of Jesus Christ because it is so outrageous. And I just think, looking at the world, we play our part and we respond to the invitations that God gives us to be part of healing and hope in the world. But there's got to be something more that's going to make this place better, or is making it better in places I don't know. Because if humans could do it, I think we would, and we just don't have the capacity, the will, whatever it is, to do it. And so I think there has to be something as unimaginable and outrageous as a body coming back to life. And I don't try to explain it away. I'm not one of those that it does, like people say, it didn't have to happen for it to be true. I just, I actually think it's true because it happened. And so here we go. And what do we do with that? And again, people come at it different ways, but that's where I land in the book, and am ever so kind of been reinforced in that as I wrote this. And my editor, Valerie, just helped me to really think through what are you trying to say a lot, and strip away I think many of our tendencies to fill in spaces that don't need to be there, and be clearer about what we believe. And I think that was really helpful for me.
Well, I appreciate you bringing up the ideas of the resurrection, because it moves us from something that we think about or ideologize into something that's enfleshed, right?
Yeah.
For us as Christians, like the ultimate idea is like, here is faith enfleshed, and it's, God's love is expressed in this physical resurrection. So how do you see the church in this day and age kind of enfleshing a gospel that is related to love and kindness and justice?
Oh, that's a wheelhouse question for you as a Methodist, me as a Presbyterian, right? I mean,
I don't know.
We were talking a little bit before that, the Presbyterian Church USA of my denomination, we are a very different church than we were 10 years ago, 15 years ago. I mean, when I held an office in our denomination, it's kind of, do you have a general secretary? I can never remember what's the hierarchy of something.
Yeah, we have bishops. Yep.
Bishops. Okay, so you're bishops, right?
Yeah,
so
council of bishops.
So I held the highest office in our denomination, and we were not at that point ordaining LGBTQI people. Our marriage was still between one man and one woman. There were a variety of things. And at our last General Assembly, we just passed a whole thing that is going to be approved that includes sexual orientation, transgender in our Constitution. This is, talk about, resurrection people. Like we were in a place where we were death dealing in many ways by what we were saying theologically. And we are now saying, no, these are things that give us life and depth and texture to who we believe God's people are. We still have a long way to go in living those out day to day. But as a church, like every time something pops up from the PCOSA on Instagram or something, and it's like Day of Transvisibility, and I'm like, this is, how did my church is,
how did we get here? Yeah.
What happened? I'm just like, before there was hemming and hawing whether you put something, about anything, and they'd have to go practically through legal before you could put something. Right. And now there's this stuff coming out. I'm like, oh my goodness, this is amazing. Now we just have to figure out, how do we share that? We're terrible at sharing what we believe. I don't know if the Methodists are any better, but Presbyterians, we're terrible at it. We have rested on our laurels. You'll find us if you want us. And I'm like, oh my goodness, we have this great kind of message right now. And it's not just about growth, but it's about impact in people's lives, creating belonging. I mean, we're just doing some amazing stuff. And so I feel like we as a denomination, others are all moving that. Now, there are some that are moving in another direction and doubling down on some of that exclusion, but we're not. And I'm like, I am overjoyed with where we're headed as a church and where you all are headed and others have been heading. It's a beautiful, welcoming, expansive, expression of Jesus in the world. And I just feel like there's so many people that faith has been dead. We have tried to say, no, it's living, and again, not perfect, but there is some good life coming out of some of these places now.
You've just come off of several weeks on the road. The book has just come out. So you may answer this question just being like, I'm just going to rest. But what are you dreaming about doing next?
Yeah, well, actually, it's a really good question for me, because I have been in this, I mean, for a Gen Xer to say, I've been in this anxious time. I mean, what Gen Xer is not, ever, always. But I've been in full-time ministry for a long time. I've been ordained in the PCUSA for almost 30 years now, and I've always had my foot in the congregation or in an organization, and I've done the writing and speaking kind of on the side. And I think sometimes there's great joy in that, been for a long time, but I think sometimes when you're splitting yourself so much, you don't really get to dive into things, and it's almost an excuse not to work on one to really kind of figure out. So I've actually recently decided that I'm going to be full-time writing, and I'm no longer going to be a pastor, which I gave up the identity as a pastor defining me a long time ago, but it is feel a little weird that for at least the next probably 5 years, I'm not dancing with a congregation or an adjudicatory or anything in that role as pastor, and I'm going to be a writer and speaker full-time, which I still have to get used to doing that without rolling in my own eyes. Because it does feel like when people used to say, I'm like, oh, must be nice. You're just writing and
yeah.
But I have a great person who's helping me kind of get over myself and really dive into that and work on the craft. Think about what is missing kind of in the world right now in this context. What can I offer? And so I'm going to be writing and speaking and all that for the foreseeable future. I am still super brand new. Like, I haven't even figured out what that looks like. I have a very rough 5-year plan about things I like to do, and now I got to fill in okay, those are big ideas. What's the first step?
Gotcha.
So that's what I'm doing. I'm very excited about it, though. I'm very excited about it.
Cool. Well, we appreciate you joining us today and sharing so much about your experience and also what you're looking forward to. So when you do get out that next book, let's talk again.
Yeah, anytime.
Fun times for sure. Do you want the fun to continue? Well, then check out another episode of the Compass Podcast. I think episode number 133 with John Pavlovitz would be a really good companion piece to this episode. Also, episode 126 with Heather Jalad, that's called Church Rethought, would match well with this episode too. It has a smooth finish that pairs well with the oaky overtones of this course. I'll stop. Hey, while you're listening or right now, leave a rating and or review. Those reviews help us connect with future guests, so it's an important part of us being able to deliver meaningful stories and content for you. The Compass Podcast is brought to you by United Methodist Communications, and that's all for this episode. We're going to be back with a new episode in 2 weeks, so I look forward to chatting at you then. In the meantime, peace.